Started. We'll probably still have a few more people arrive, but I wanted to formally welcome you to this virtual event with Nicholas Allen of UGA's Willson Center and Claudio Saunt of UGA. My name is Janet Geddes. I am the business owner and founder at Avid Bookshop, which is currently Athens' only independently owned bookstore, and certainly the only bookstore in town that really focuses on reader engagement, author events, and finding creative ways to connect you with books that will affect your life and your relationship with yourself and with other people. It's something that we pride ourselves on. And so when we got the opportunity to host Claudio Saunt, we were thrilled to say yes. Unfortunately, the pandemic came along, so we weren't able to do the in-person event that we so richly wanted to do. When we reevaluated things and decided to start doing virtual events, we immediately knew that we wanted to rebook the Claudio Saunt event that we had to cancel in the spring. And our partners at the Willson Center, the UGA Center for Arts and Humanities, willingly jumped in to help us promote. And you will soon meet Nicholas Allen, the director, who will be in conversation with Claudio. Just before we get started formally, we want to give you guys the best experience you can visually and auditorially. So if you currently are seeing a lot of grayed out screens, a lot of people, first of all, if your camera's on, we want you to hide your camera by in the bottom left video of your screen, just hit stop video and also mute yourself. I believe everyone's done that. And then if you're still seeing a lot of gray rectangles with people's names on them, all you have to do is hover over any one of those gray rectangles, and go to the upper right-hand corner. So if you're hovered over there and in the upper right-hand corner of any one of those gray rectangles, there'll be a little blue box with 3 white dots in it. And if you click that once, underneath you'll see something that says hide non-video participants. And once you do that, the only people you will see is me, Janet, Nicholas Allen, and Claudio Saunt. So it's more like a TV show. If you do have to leave early tonight, which we hope you won't, rest assured you'll be getting an email about this event after it concludes, and we'll also be putting this on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm going to bow out for now. I'll see you at the end of the event. I would like to turn it over to Nicholas Allen.
Thank you, Janet. I'm not sure I can do much to help all of your visual enjoyment of the evening, but I hope that I'll be able to help you with something of the audio. We're here for a very special evening tonight, which is to mark the recognition of Claudio Saunt's career making book, Unworthy Republic, which is one of the most haunting reads I have ever had of history, and its selection as a finalist for the National Book Award. And before we move to that conversation, which should run for about 30 or 35 minutes between Claudio and I, and then if you would send me questions, I will be happy to share those with Claudio for the last part of the evening. But I just want to thank Janet and Avid Bookstore. Avid is a central part of the town. It was when it was in my neighborhood in the town, and when it moved over to 5 Points Remain. So it's something that nourished my family with books over the last 5-6 years, and something I hope that you all continue to support and enjoy. And thank you, Janet, and your team for allowing us to be here today to celebrate and talk about Claudio's great achievement and troubling subject in Unworthy Republic, the Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. Claudio is in the history department at the University of Georgia and is also part of the Institute of Native American Studies. And I wanted to recognize those two great entities for all that they do to strengthen the reputation of the University of Georgia. So Claudio, this dreadful narrative of appalling iniquity, I don't think I've ever read it more clearly told. And I just wanted to start by asking you with the simple question of why you wrote the book, where it began as an idea and a reality.
Yeah, so it's really one of the most familiar stories in Native American history, and for that reason, I had left it alone for the almost 30 some years that I've been researching and thinking about Native American history, and that changed when I inherited my grandfather's correspondence, and the correspondence runs from the early second decade of the 20th century. Really through the 1970s. But the interesting part of it, at least in relationship to Indian removal, is that he corresponded, he fled from Hungary in 1938. And he continued then corresponding with his parents and his siblings in Hungary. Through 1943, Hungarian Jews were the last to be deported in the spring of 1944. So there's this incredible record, kind of inside view of what it was like to live in Hungary as a Jew during this horrendous period. His family was deported to Auschwitz and they all died there. But so that correspondence was in Hungarian. I had it translated. I read through it. I started reading some of the literature about deportations during World War II, but also more generally in the 20th century. And then I started reflecting on why Indian removal, as it's commonly called, seems so different. And I had long been kind of unsatisfied with the literature surrounding Indian removal. It emphasizes above all the tragedy of the event, and it's undeniably a tragic story. But there was very little information about how the process actually unfolded, how it was administered, what were state administrators thinking. This was a huge operation for a young state. The United States had about 8,000 or 9,000 federal employees in all in the early 19th century, and the vast majority of those folks worked for the post office. So that kind of got me into it, wondering why we think of Indian removal as different, and maybe we shouldn't, and maybe we can put Indian removal in the context of these other state-sponsored mass deportations in the late 19th and 20th centuries.
Sure, and one of the things that I noticed about the book at the beginning is that discussion, which I wasn't expecting really, about vocabulary and about the words to use. And when you speak about that 20th century European experience, it reminds me of the necessity of words that are adequate to resist the barbarity of these events. And maybe you would share a little bit with people, with our audience, with our friends who are with us, just the kinds of conversations you had to have with yourself about finding words and terms that you felt represented this, perhaps not unworthy republic, but unfinished republic, which didn't yet have a vocabulary to express the reach of its expansionism.
So I think one of the first things I did before I even started doing research in the archives was just to open a document and write down all of the standard terminology that we use to discuss this. So Indian removal first and foremost, but Indian tribe, warrior, and principal chief, all of these very familiar terms that we associate with indigenous history. And then I would write down in the second column maybe an equivalent. So instead of warrior, perhaps I would use gunman. Instead of chief, perhaps I would simply use leader. I don't use the word Indian in the book, except to when I'm quoting other people. And I don't refer to this event as Indian removal. That was actually a term that was coined by the proponents. And it's obviously since then been widely embraced. So I call it an expulsion, which the opponents called it most frequently. Some observers from abroad called it a deportation. I do use that word occasionally. I like it because it gets, I think, at the state involvement and administration of the event. And I also call it at certain times and places an extermination. And in fact, that's also historically accurate. There are generals at the time who write letters back and forth and say that the Secretary of War, as he was then called, is going for extermination. That's a direct quote. But I think you're absolutely right. What we call this event and the words we use to talk about it are really essential to how we understand it.
And one of the things I found both moving and shocking in reading the book was within these declensions of otherness that were created to put a kind of literary or cultural veneer on this great act of greed and murder. were the voices that you managed to find in the archives, and to find the book is punctuated by these rhymes and stories, little asides, little catches in the narrative of accounts that people gave in their own voices, in their own, I shouldn't say ungrammatical, but in their own adaptation of English as it had come to them. And I wonder, would you talk a little bit about how you find those kinds of voices, and just to compliment you really on the way that you wove that in with your account of the bureaucracy and the infrastructure and all the missteps. But tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, and first, just to say something about the bureaucracy, that was, I spent a summer in Washington just photographing records in the National Archives. And I was really attuned to the administrative records, not merely for what they told me, but as objects themselves, illustrating to me something about the nature of this event. I was attuned to that because I had read all the literature in the 20th century about deportations. So there's that side of the story. But then, as you said, there's this other side, which is to kind of capture the voices of the people, the perpetrators, as well as the victims of this event. Trying to find indigenous voices it's one of the great challenges that historians face. There were some literate indigenous leaders in the early 19th century who left behind rather large archives. The best known of these is John Ross of the Cherokee Nation, but there are others, Peter Pitchlynn of the Choctaws, and those records were extraordinarily valuable. But then also, if you dig into government records, you will find it's often just a sentence or two, a quotation. And of course, you have to ask yourself, how accurate is this quote? But a quotation from a Native woman or someone who had been dispossessed. And later in the 1840s, there are a bunch of government committees that investigate what had happened, and there they interview Native peoples. Again, it's just snippets, but you actually, I think, get a sense. You can kind of hear them speaking through these records.
Yeah, I thought that was wonderful in the book, the way you could hear the records speaking against their intentions, more than a century later, how you could begin to see that. And I was really struck actually with that little aside about what the steamboat meant to people whenever they saw it, and what it meant to different people in the Western European, perhaps in the Anglo tradition, the idea of modernity and exploration, but it was a prison ship and an instrument of terror to people who were being moved upon it, the Choctaw in particular. And I love that description, that little aside that you had about Peter Pitchlynn, which I had no idea that he'd met Charles Dickens on the steamboat, which I thought would be, a wonderful moment for a play now to think about these things. But Claudio, within this detail, which is punctuated so richly by so many kinds of voices which demand now to be heard, for those of you who haven't read the book, who are with us this evening, one of the things that really struck me was the scale of all this, the projected cost of it, the actual cost, the number of people involved, the role of the American Army. Could you even give just a sort of a general sketch for people? And then we'll move from there, I think, to talking a little bit about the state of Georgia within this. But just to begin,
sure.
A national level, as America then was, or the United States, what scope of undertaking was this?
So there were about 80 to 100,000 indigenous Americans living east of the Mississippi River in the United States at the time. That perhaps doesn't seem like a lot in some ways. It's far fewer than there had been, certainly, in previous centuries. But even today, for a modern state, with all of the technologies that we have, it's difficult to conduct a humanitarian operation. And when I say that, I simply mean you're not moving an army. You're moving men, women, children, pregnant women, elderly folks, toddlers, infants. It's a whole nother order of difficulty, the logistics of it. So even today, it's difficult to conduct that kind of operation. In the early 19th century, the United States, as I said, had fewer than 10,000 federal employees. They were overwhelmed with the logistics, and they're moving folks hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 miles to the west over land where there are no roads. They have to build the roads to start. They have to construct bridges over rivers. They need to map the region. They don't even quite know where they're going. And so this leads, and there's some comic moments where in the War Department, where they're trying to figure out where is this river. It's mentioned on a treaty. Where is the river? It doesn't appear on any maps. And then they send out a surveyor who comes back and says there is no such river. So I mean, they really have no sense, and they are overwhelmed. There's that side of the story, but then related to this is that there's very little goodwill towards the people whom they are deporting. So for the most part, they don't really care that it's a catastrophe almost from the outset. When the food doesn't show up, or when the rations show up and they're rotten, as happens frequently, no one really cares that much. If they're in short supply, if, as happens in one event, there were 1,500 Choctaws camped on a bluff on the Arkansas River for 6 weeks in snow and sleet without any tents and very few supplies, they don't really care that much. So they are overwhelmed, certainly just in the logistics of it, but they also don't really care ultimately what happens.
And I thought that was one of the great ethical rebukes in your narrative whenever you were discussing this from the terms of a timetable, and of a timetable disposed of centrally but acted out locally in human time, and that murder of the creeks, really. And you have that list of the people who cannot be moved, the children who cannot move, the women who cannot change a pregnancy, the elderly who cannot avoid sickness. And I thought that you caught that very well. And I mean, one of the engines behind all this too, just while we're on this idea of infrastructure, I was going to come to it later, but we may address it now, is this idea of the kind of the capital expansion that powered and motored all this. So on one hand, you have an army or a culture that does not appreciate the humanity of the individuals that it's expropriating and disposing of. At the same time, you have very interesting parts of the book with financiers from the north, and we'll follow this, we'll go back to Georgia, but who were powering this kind of movement by their speculation. Would you talk to me a little bit about that history of speculation and how it intertwines with this history of mass murder, really?
This really surprised me when I stumbled across it. It's not part of the kind of traditional narrative of Indian removal. We think of it largely as a Southern story, and it mostly was. Most of the people who were deported were living in the South. And certainly Georgia was at the center of pushing for this piece of legislation that launched the whole operation. But Northern financiers, Wall Street bankers, immediately recognized that there was this extraordinary opportunity to invest in indigenous lands or exploit the indigenous peoples. And so all of the leading bankers in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston immediately formed joint stock companies, capitalized at sometimes over $1 million in 1830s dollars. That's huge. And then worked in various ways to separate Native peoples from their lands in the South. And what's even more extraordinary is that you can follow the capital flow with some difficulty, given the state of the records, but it crosses the Atlantic to London. There are London and bankers who are investing in this as well. And I found one reference to investors on the European continent investing also. I haven't pursued that line. I don't know how widespread it was. William Wordsworth, his daughter ends up inheriting some shares in the Mississippi, New York Land Company, which has been involved in dispossessing Choctaws and Chickasaws. So it's, in some sense, there's this international flow of capital into the United States and into flooding indigenous lands.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, tell me then, and so then bringing it along, and I suppose I have two questions in mind, and thinking you've got this international aspect, and I'm thinking also that you tell the global story of cholera so very well too, in the way that terrible movement of cholera through troop movements, even but starting in India, coming across, I suppose, the British Empire, through Europe, coming across the Atlantic, coming down the rivers, and then meeting terribly with the deportation of the Choctaws, another version of that global story. But it's also a story about locality. And sitting now as I am in a building, which is just off Lumpkin Street in Athens, Georgia, thinking about Governor Troop as he was, and thinking also about the history of plantation. I mean, I was so struck when I got to the later part of the book and I saw that overlaid map that you had of indigenous lands which had been expropriated, which were then overlain with populations of people who were unfree. And it was really remarkable. It's a capital story. It's a story of plantation growth. But tell me a little bit about Georgia in this sense that at least some people in the political class had then this howling state, as it was described by one uh, politician of the time, was to be civilized but exploited through this expropriation.
I think it's safe to say that without Georgia, this operation never would have been launched. It was Georgia politicians beginning in the 1820s, who were talking about it incessantly and pushing. And when Troop was governor in 1825, he threatened to go to war, to send state militia against federal troops. And it just continues at every step in Congress. There are Georgia senators and congressmen who are kind of forcing this, pushing this forward. Willson Lumpkin, you mentioned, it's the state, it's the state, but Athens is right in the middle of it. Willson Lumpkin, probably more than any Georgia politician, was in the middle of this event, and just what he said was his life's work, he said. And he wrote 2 volumes about bragging, boasting about his role in Indian removal. So it is, it's quite extraordinary, as you kind of hinted, that you suggested we have Lumpkin Street. I live a couple blocks from it, and of course, the University of Georgia is built mostly on what used to be his plantation. There were other folks, Augustine Clayton. Of course, we all know Clayton Street. He was a state judge who had rendered several different decisions, including one really infamous decision against the Cherokees. He later apologized, but too little too late, really. William Deering of Deering Street was a major investor, one of the original investors in one of these joint stock companies that Wall Street bankers were involved in. So it's just, there are connections all over the place.
Yeah, I have begun to think recently that there's a conversation to be had about the naming of places and places like this, but maybe that's and your book educated me at least to begin to think about that in an intelligent way. So we're getting questions that are coming in through, and I promise everybody that I will get to them, but I wanted to ask you a couple more of my own if you didn't mind. But I promise everybody I hear you, I can see your questions in the chat, and I'm grateful for them. But I was struck, I suppose perhaps this conversation about street names is part of it, but that at least there are places within reach of us that one could go to, where if one couldn't imagine or experience what had happened, it might at least give you a set of sensory coordinates to think through the place and to read the book in a way that would give you another layer of context to it. Not the defining context, but a context. And so I wanted to ask you just, could you tell me a little bit about a person or 2 people and a place or 2 places that stayed with you after the book, that people who've read your book who are in Athens or in Georgia might be able to visit and go and meditate or think or reflect on what the book tells us and what it means and what it requires of us, I think, too.
So we'll put aside our friend Willson Lumpkin for the moment and his house, which is on UGA's campus. One of the I found extraordinarily rich sources was a diary, a multi-volume diary left by a really erudite and thoughtful, introspective West Point graduate named Nathaniel Weish Hunter. His journals are in Mills College in Oakland, California, of all places. I don't know how they ended up there. He ended up serving in the Second Seminole War, which is really part of the story of Indian removal. He was there for 5 years and was cynical and became ever more disillusioned as he was watching what was going on in Florida and this just horrific war against Seminole families. And he, like a number of soldiers, fell into this spiral of depression, was abusing alcohol. He then later turned to opium. And after he was discharged, he married a woman from Athens, but died shortly afterwards. I think at age 37. And he's actually buried at Oconee Hill Cemetery. I've seen a picture of his tombstone. I actually haven't made the trip over there yet, but that's one place I would like to visit. I think most of the audience knew Achota and the Van House. There are other lesser known sites. I like to just go to North Georgia. Brasstown Bald is behind me. It's Cherokee country. It appears in the book when a valuator, as he was called, this federal officer, went there and jotted down, recorded all the property that was held by Cherokees in this region before they were deported. But I wanted to mention there was an extraordinary draftsman. He was actually a Baptist minister who lived in Jasper, Georgia, died in the 1980s, I believe. But he went around North Georgia and drew sketches of corn cribs and tools and the few Cherokee houses that were still standing in the 1980s. They're beautiful drawings. Most of these houses, I bet, have since just fallen apart. Some of them, I bet, still exist. A lot of them are on private property. His name is Charles Walker, and the book is called Cherokee Images. It's published by the Georgia Association of the Trail of Tears Association, but it's kind of wonderfully evocative of the remnants of the Cherokee Nation in Georgia.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask you two more questions, I think, and then I will move on to the many wonderful questions we had in the chat. And one was that I was struck, perhaps this takes us a little bit back to the unfinished state of the United States, but about the issue of contingency in the book. And you talk about it at the start in the votes, the 5 votes that carried the policy in the original instance, and you wonder at the end how the history of this republic might have looked had those 5 votes not carried the actions that followed it. And also, if President Jackson had not been elected as he was in the early 1830s. And so I just wanted to ask you, have you any reflections on contingency on the other paths of history? And also related to that, just any reflection after conducting this history about how leadership matters? Because there were numbers of soldiers who actually did make choices to try and be more humane. And also there was great agency in Native peoples in their various works of resistance and in their various works of adaptation and in their various commentaries in their own voices about what was happening. I just wondered, would you share with me a little?
So the legislation that authorizes the president to exchange lands to use the words of the legislation itself. This legislation was passed in May of 1830 by 5 votes in the House. And this is in a House that's overwhelmingly Jacksonian. It was the single most controversial issue to face the Republic up to that point. It generated the first mass petition campaign to Congress. It was overwhelmed by hundreds of petitions signed by thousands of white Northerners, including white women who in that era were not seen to have a role in politics, a role to play in politics. There were also petitions sent in, not surprisingly, by indigenous peoples. So one of the things I tried to do in the book was get away from the sense of inevitability. It's the word Indian itself is so laden with, and we know the end of the story. And so depending on your perspective, either Native peoples were too primitive or noble to survive in the United States, or white Americans were too avaricious. But it was ultimately a political decision that voting Americans and their representatives made voting Americans at the time were all white men. And there was nothing inevitable about it. Certainly the native peoples they were lobbying in Congress. And in fact, in the case of the Cherokees, right up until the early spring of 1838, there does seem to be a possibility that they would have been able to retain a portion of their homeland. So there's that whole side of the story, but you also talk about, you mentioned leadership. And yes, Jackson, I mean, there was lots of blame to go around, starting with planter politicians in the South and in Georgia, and investment bankers in New York City. But certainly they needed a friend in the White House, and they found it in Jackson, who had a long history of going to war against Native Americans. And he also replaced, yeah, it does sound a bit like the Trump administration. He dismissed all of the experienced administrators in the War Department as soon as he got into office, and appointed a bunch of his political friends. The agent to the Cherokees who was appointed had zero experience, except he had campaigned in Nashville for Jackson, and then had worked in the post office. And there are just countless stories like that of just getting rid of the folks who actually had established relationships with Native peoples, and instead getting these guys who had no qualifications except that they were dedicated to Jackson. So yes, it is a political decision. Political leadership certainly matters, and so did the politics in Congress at the time.
And then in that longer durée, I was struck, there's a phrase that you use at the end of the book, and you talk about, and it's a grim phrase, but necessary to the subject, the work of death. And I just wanted to ask you, and this is just from your perspective as a historian, having worked in those archives, or perhaps someone who also thinks now as a citizen, and for all that we can now remember or recover, there are also stories of persistence and survival and love, if not reparation. And I just wondered, for all of that, you do gesture at the end about that 1,000 years of knowledge that was lost. But I just wondered, if it was an unworthy republic, is it an unworthy republic? What would a worthy republic look like in memory of what had happened?
So both in these petition campaigns, the reference point is always the American Revolution, which was only a few decades in the past at that time. And there was a belief that the United States was, or might be, or could be, if it lived up to its ideals, different from what they imagined to be these corrupt states, imperial states in Europe. So we can scoff cynically at that, but it does matter what people believe, and it shapes how they act. And so in the petitions, they were calling congressmen to live up to these ideals. Native Americans did this as well, perhaps merely strategically, or perhaps because they also believed, some of them believed in this language too, it's hard to say. But they did, the Cherokees quoted the Declaration of Independence to Jackson. So there was this real sense that if this deportation were to unfold, according to the Removal Act, that the United States would in some ways be worse than these empires in Europe, because it would have it would have committed the crime, and yet it would go on prating about democracy and justice and living up to the ideals of the revolution. Clearly, the United States failed in the 1830s. How might it have been different? I mean, it's hard to say, but I wouldn't want to underestimate the creativity and adaptability of indigenous politicians in the 1830s. Some of them were just extraordinarily astute and understood the lay of the land in Washington. And if they had been able to retain their homelands, I think that that would have established a different geography in the United States in which Indian nations were within the Republic. Because by 1840, with a very few exceptions, they were all on the western, they had been relocated to the westernmost advancing edge. And so what unfolds in the second half of the 19th century is this edge being pushed further and further west by the army, and with no place for Native peoples to go, they're slaughtered or herded onto small reservations.
And you're right about the fatality of being on the edge of that expanding republic with great brilliance, I think, too. We have many wonderful questions. I'm going to read some of them, and I'll try to get to everyone. And we have time, I think, for all of them. So thank you for all being so attentive and engaged. And the first one is from my friend and colleague, Barbara McCaskill. And she asks, in addition to including quotations of Native peoples, even if filtered through white Americans' correspondence or documents, can you talk, please, about other ways in which your book articulates the humanity of Indigenous peoples?
So, I think at every turn, as someone who writes about Native American history, at every turn in the book, and every sentence really, I have to keep reminding, I have to remind myself that I'm looking at this story not from the perspective of a US citizen or one of the state administrators. I was always asking myself, how does this look from the other side? So I can look at indigenous voices, but I can also look at archaeological records or some of the interesting work that has been done on ethnobotany, and that comes up in the book, because one of the major losses when they're moving is, Nicholas, as you mentioned, 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the land, about where to fish, where to farm, when to plant seeds. Very detailed knowledge that was essential to survive. So when you're moving west, there's no Home Depot and there's no Kroger in Indian territory. You have to rebuild from scratch. So just to, at every turn, trying to place myself in that situation and think, like, what is this going to mean for my family and me to be kicked out of my homeland?
Yeah, and actually you capture the tyranny of that continual exhaustion very well. I thought that sense of moving and being moved and being uprooted and being dispossessed, and that sense of as states expand their forms of mono-agriculture and their forms of exploitation of labor, of enslavement, just the way that it both destroyed people and destroyed land. And it was like,
yeah, the transformation is tremendous. It's so rapid. It occurs in the space of a few years. If you look at Mississippi, which we think of as most people think of the history of Mississippi and Alabama, it's the Confederacy, but in the middle of the 1830s, half of Mississippi was still native land. It's 25 years before the Civil War starts, and about a third of Alabama, the heart of the Confederacy, is indigenous. In the space of a few years, it's clear cut, and cotton. Tens of thousands of enslaved people are put to work and put to work growing cotton. The transformation is really it's hard to conceptualize just how dramatic it is, and both at the level of kind of society and culture, but also, as you say, the environment.
And Claudia, we have a very good question from James Brooks minute, but earlier we had been asked a question by Robbie Etheridge, which is also speaks, I think, to these points. And your book, it educated me very much in the mechanics of the army, in the infrastructure of the bureaucratic state. in the diversity of native peoples of the South as I've come to understand it, and it made me feel how much more I still have to learn and read. But I wondered too, would you talk a little bit, and just briefly before I want to ask you the question from James, about the idea of contractors, about this layer of middlemen who are between the state, the speculators, people who purchase land, the people who really, and maybe this has a 20th century echo, but I shouldn't perhaps use the word complicity, but the people who make the machine work, even if the machine works irregularly. Would you have anything to say about them?
So they're the clerks in Washington. I spent some time. I mean, they're fascinating people because they make the government run, and they're just pushing paper all. It's the era before photocopiers, so they go to work and they write in these huge leather volumes. They produced hundreds and hundreds of them, but that's what keeps the gears turning for this operation. And then there are the contractors, and this will be familiar to those of us in the 21st century because the government decides it's going to be cheaper to outsource some of this. And in particular, they decide they're going to outsource the provisioning of the people who were deported. And so they sign these contracts with some unsavory businessmen based in Alabama in one instance. And of course, they're paid a certain fixed amount to provision Creek peoples as they're being shipped west. Their profit is going to turn on the difference between what they're paid and what they have to buy to feed these people. So I mean, I mentioned this earlier, the provisions are frequently not there, they're rotten, there's rotten meat that's completely inedible that shows up at depots along the way. And then it's difficult and costly to get the food to the right place at the right time. There's no FedEx or UPS, so that's a whole nother place where they can make some money. But the upshot of all of this is that Creek peoples, and they say this, they're disgusted by how they're treated. And there's some instances where people end up literally starving on the road because there's just nothing to eat.
I'm going to ask you two more questions which have come in, and I promise you, James, I will get to yours. And actually, I'm going to finish up with James's question as a way of also asking you what a future project might look like. But Cassia Roth has just asked us, do all of these parallels, contractors, cronyism, separating families, deporting people, make you less or more anxious about today's current politics? And you can answer that or not answer it.
I don't know that I can answer that question. What I can say is that I think all history is informed by the present. Of course, I started this project in 2014. So things have changed since when I started it. But as I was going, there were moments when I was looking around, increasingly angry by what was going on. And I think that both inspired the writing, but of course you have to have some fealty to the past. You can't obviously make it up. So there were other times when I was worried that what I was writing was too much inflected by what was going on today. But certainly the parallels, and they're not just parallels, they're actually some concrete links. There's a term that the federal government uses called expedited removal. That's the official government term for removing an undocumented immigrant without recourse to a judge. So it basically empowers federal officers to pick someone up off the street and ship them to wherever their presumed home country is. Expedited removal, it used to be called something else. It's clearly a euphemism. And there's some legal and constitutional connections as well in this process. I won't go into that right here in detail because they're quite complex, but it's fascinating. They're certainly there, and it certainly influenced the way I wrote about this.
Yeah, well, I also think it's a book that, I mean, whoever reads it will have a head full of echoes afterwards, and each of those echoes will have a different resonance for a different reader. And I think that's actually a mark of its great genius, really. If you'll allow me the recording this Sunday, Claudio, so you'll be able to tell me that I said this in future years, but I do believe it. It's a wonderful book. But I mean, I was thinking of Ireland so much in the 19th century as I thought about this, but also you talk about the present. The present lasts a long time. I think that's also what we were thinking about in the idea of an unworthy republic, with the rebuke of what happened then as the rebuke of what happened that you kindly shared with us. That terrible history in your own family from the 20th century Europe is something that stays with us. And I think you're right as a historian to be conscious of those things as you write. Those presences are always with us, and I admire how you managed to articulate them in such a moving narrative. So I have one last question, and I know that Charlie has been asking about the rationale for removal and deportation. And Charlie, the book is wonderful at explaining the legal background and the debates and the historicization of those cultural arguments. But I wanted to finish with James, who I promised I would get to. And it's really a question about how you talk about the simultaneity of Indian dispossession and deportation with the extension of Black enslaved labor into the West via Indian territory. But feel free to speak to that. But it made me think perhaps that question could be extended into what another book would look like. You have written this great book. You have been on the West Coast on the fringe of the Republic. You've moved east in your last book. In this book, you've taken us out to this sharp, murderous edge of this unfinished state. Are those the kind of intertwined narratives that you'd like to follow further?
That's an unfair question, Nicholas. I guess one thing I would want to say, in some ways, the sequel to the book has been written. I mean, it's written by many people, but David Troyer, just a couple of years ago, published a book which is really about the survival of these people, and the rebuilding of communities, which is really quite extraordinary, what happens in the later 19th century and obviously all through the 20th century, just that will to persevere and survive. And he tells it extraordinarily well, and it's beautifully written also. So, but you know, where my own research will take me at this point, it's premature.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say, well, thank you for the book. It moved me. It taught me a lot, and forever has been part of this conversation. I want to say that I hope I've approached this conversation with the proper humility, because it's a wide subject about a complicated time, which I find troubling and contemporary, but also told with an ethical heart and a clarity that really quite moved me. So, Claudio, thank you for allowing me to learn with you, as the great books do. I appreciate it very much. And thank you all for being with us over this past hour, which flew by. And thank you too for supporting Avid Bookshop. And I'll pass you over to Janet now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was extraordinary. And I guess for those of us who are wanting more, we can just pick up a copy of the book. One thing I do want to say is typically when someone is on the National Book Award finalist list, you'd be able to go into our store and get an edition of the book with a little seal on it that says that. Pandemic, so we don't have that, but we did create a little seal so Claudio could see his book officially. With the real seal is not going to be this big, but there are new editions coming out with the seal. But here's the Avid version, so we can sell it. So, congratulations again. We are really thrilled with the turnout for this event. We really thank everybody who, especially Nicholas and Claudio, for sharing your time and talent with us. But we also know that people are not only overwhelmed with just daily life, but also are getting a little zoomed out with events. So it means a lot that we had such extraordinary turnout for this. Again, this will be on YouTube once it is produced and published. And Claudio has offered to come into the store. We'll have a very safe, masked, contactless signing. So if you want to order a copy of Unworthy Republic from avidbookshop.com or by calling us, just go to our website for all that information. You can order it And in the order notes, if you want Claudio to inscribe it to someone in particular, like if you want to give these as gifts to everybody in your family, for instance, you can say on the order notes, like, I want this one to Nicholas, this one to Janet, and we will have Claudio come in and sign a big stack of these for y'all. So thank you again. Congratulations, Claudio. Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you people in Athens who are here, and I know there are a lot of people from all over who attended the event tonight. So if you don't have an Avid in your neighborhood, we're happy to be your online bookseller. And if you're not sure if you have an independent bookstore nearby, message us and we can help you find whatever the closest one is. So thank you so much. Everyone have a great night.
Thanks.